They were just three kids walking home on a hot summer evening. August 16th, 1969. Last day anyone saw them alive. A brother, a sister, and their best friend, gone between the cornfields and the creek. For 50 years, this town told the same story. Some stranger took them. But when police opened the Summerfield property in 2019, what they found didn't point to a stranger. It pointed home. This is the hollow season, the story of how a family's silence became a national obsession. If you believe the truth should be louder than the lies, subscribe. The cardboard box had no label when it was delivered, just a faded sheriff's seal and a return address long since erased by time. Inside the evidence room, its tape peeled like scabs, the corners dented from half a century of being shuffled between archives. Detective Evelyn Shaw ran her gloved fingers along the edge of it, reading the faint stamp beneath the dust. Summerfield case, 1969. Her breath caught a little. Even after 20 years in cold case review, that name still felt heavier than the rest. She sliced the tape open. Inside were photographs first, black and white, curled at the edges. A dirt road, a child's bicycle lying on its side, a shoe too small, half buried in clay, and one photo in particular, 3 children standing in front of a barn. Sunlight washed the color out, but she could tell the season, high summer, humid and merciless. The oldest boy, maybe 12, had one arm around his sister. Between them, a younger kid held a paper kite, its tail shredded. The caption on the back read in blue ink, "Last day before school." She'd seen the picture 100 times in old reports and TV documentaries, but holding it now felt different. The texture of it, the faint smell of mildew. It made the story physical. The official narrative was simple back then. On the evening of August 16th, 1969, the 3 children, Tommy and Grace Summerfield, and their friend Eddie Marks, walked toward the edge of the woods outside Miller's Creek and never came home. Hundreds searched. Dogs traced their scent as far as the creek bed. No blood, no bodies, no clues. Within 2 weeks, the case went national. Within 2 months, it went cold. But what the file never showed, what Evelyn knew because her mother used to whisper it when she thought no one was listening, was that the Summerfields had stopped talking to anyone after that summer. The house boarded up, the father vanished, and the mother. She'd stayed. Until her arrest 50 years later. Evelyn flipped through the file. There it was, the press clipping from 2019. Elderly woman arrested in connection with 1969 disappearance. The photo showed a frail woman in handcuffs being led down the porch steps of the same farmhouse from the 1960s photograph. Gray hair, thin frame, eyes hidden behind oxygen tubing. Evelyn remembered that day. She'd been there. The excavation had taken 12 hours. They'd found bones under the porch. Not 3 sets, but 1. And that had only made the story worse. The rest of the folder contained maps, interrogation transcripts, a notebook wrapped in wax paper. She opened it carefully. Inside, in a trembling hand, someone had written, "We said they were gone to keep what was left safe." Evelyn sat back in her chair. Rain tapped against the evidence room window, faint and rhythmic. Somewhere down the hall, the building's old clock chimed 7. She took a slow breath. The case had reopened itself when that note was discovered, but this wasn't about procedure anymore. It was about history, and the lies families tell to survive it. She glanced again at the photograph. 3 children, smiling into sunlight that no longer existed. She whispered to the empty room, "Let's start over." Outside, thunder rolled across the hills. The hollow season had begun again. In the summer of 1969, the town of Miller's Creek smelled like wet hay and gasoline. The roads shimmered with heat. Cicadas shrieked from the sycamores, and the days seemed to last forever. The Summerfields lived on the edge of town, in a farmhouse that leaned toward the horizon like it was tired of standing. Frank Summerfield worked at the grain mill. His wife, Ruth, ran the feed store part-time. Their children, Tommy, 12, Grace, 10, and Eddie Marks, the neighbor's boy, 11, were inseparable. That August felt endless to them. They built forts by the creek, caught tadpoles in mason jars, and chased the county train until its whistle vanished into the hills. Every evening, Ruth called them home with the same old brass bell that hung by the porch. The sound of it meant dinner, meant safety. On the 16th, the air turned strange. The storm that had been circling the valley all week broke apart, leaving the sky too quiet. Grace noticed it first, the way the wind carried no sound, how even the birds had gone still. They were supposed to be home by 6. At 6:15, Ruth called from the porch. At 6:30, she rang the bell again. No answer. By sunset, the first neighbors had joined the search. Flashlights bobbed through the fields, calling the children's names. At midnight, the sheriff's office declared a missing persons alert. By morning, the creek was swarmed with men in uniform. The town gathered along the fence lines, silent and sleepless. Reporters came from Dallas, then Chicago. Sheriff Holloway gave his statement in front of the Summerfield barn. 3 children. No struggle. We'll find them. But the eyes of the crowd were already turning toward Ruth. Her hands shook. Her voice faltered. She kept repeating the same words. They were just playing. They were just playing. When the 3rd day passed and no trace was found, rumors bloomed like mold. Some said a drifter's truck was seen near the road. Others whispered about Frank's temper, his late nights at the mill. The argument heard the morning the children disappeared. Then Frank stopped coming home. 2 weeks later, a fisherman found his truck abandoned by the river, keys still in the ignition. The town held a vigil on the church steps, candles trembling in the wind. By fall, only Ruth remained in the farmhouse. The brass bell stayed on its hook, motionless. Years later, when Evelyn Shaw first saw the photograph of those children, she realized what haunted her most wasn't that they vanished. It was that everyone in the picture seemed to be looking slightly off camera toward something no one else had noticed. And maybe, she thought, that was where the truth had been waiting all along. By dawn on the 4th day, Miller's Creek no longer felt like a town but a wound, raw, open, and endlessly prodded. The sheriff's office had set up a command post at the old Grange Hall. Floodlights threw harsh cones of white into the gray morning as volunteers shuffled in with coffee and flashlights. The Summerfield disappearance had become a kind of fever. Whole families joined the search, wading into the woods, combing ditches, walking shoulder to shoulder through the tall grass like soldiers sweeping a battlefield. Ruth Summerfield sat on the porch, a blanket draped around her shoulders. Her eyes had gone glassy from sleeplessness. The brass bell hung inches from her head, still untouched. A deputy offered her water. She nodded but didn't drink. She just kept staring toward the cornfields, as though her gaze alone could call the children back. Frank's brother Harold had arrived that morning from 2 counties over. He was a big man, quiet, his face already burned red from hours outside. He spoke little but stayed near Ruth, trying to fill the silence that pressed in on her. At 9:15 a.m., Sheriff Holloway and his deputies reached the far bend of Miller's Creek, where the water slowed into dark pools under the willows. The dogs barked once, then went silent. One of the handlers, a wiry man named George Latimer, leaned down to study the mud. "Tracks," he said. 3 sets. Barefoot. The sheriff crouched beside him. The prints were faint but clear enough. A child's heel, a small arch, toes pressed into soft silt. They led along the bank, then vanished where the creek deepened. "Could have been from before," Holloway said quietly. George shook his head. "Rain came through last night. These are fresh. They followed the creek downstream for another half-mile until it disappeared under a tangle of fallen branches. When they reached the end, there was nothing. No shoes, no torn cloth, no sign of struggle. Holloway stood staring at the water. He'd been sheriff long enough to know that sometimes a mystery begins not where something happened, but where it stopped. That afternoon, the local radio station aired live updates every hour. The missing poster, 3 smiling faces, ages 12, 11, and 10, hung in every shop window and gas pump from Miller's Creek to Wichita Falls. And still, no one came forward. That night, Holloway returned to the Summerfield farm to speak with Ruth again. The porch light flickered as he climbed the steps. Inside, the house smelled of damp wood and cold coffee. "Mrs. Summerfield," he said gently, removing his hat. "We need to go over the timeline once more." Her hands twisted the edge of her blanket. "I've told you." "I know. Just walk me through that afternoon again." She closed her eyes. They were playing out back after lunch. Tommy was flying the kite Eddie brought. Grace was helping him with the string. They wanted to go down to the creek. I said no, it was too close to dark. But they laughed and said they'd only be a minute. She swallowed hard. "That's all." "Was your husband home?" A pause. "He was in town. Errands. Anyone see him?" Her voice thinned. "He came back around 5, said the truck was acting up, then he left again. When the children didn't come back, he went to look for them." "Did he say which way?" "No." She turned toward the window. "You think he ran?" Holloway hesitated. "We just want to find them." She looked at him then, eyes hollow and steady. "You won't." When he left, she stood in the doorway long after his taillights disappeared. The air was thick with the scent of corn and wet soil. Somewhere in the dark, the bell gave a faint metallic tremor, though no wind had touched it. Days blurred. The search widened to 10 miles, then 20. Reporters arrived by the dozen, their flashbulbs igniting like lightning each time Ruth stepped outside. They called it the Summerfield tragedy, the headline stretching across front pages from Texas to Illinois. One reporter from Life magazine stayed in town longer than the rest. His name was Alan Drake, young, sharp-eyed, and too curious for his own safety. He photographed everything: the creek, the barns, the searchers, the endless dusk. Later, people would say that his pictures captured something the others didn't, the way the town seemed to be searching for itself, not just the children. By the 10th day, the sheriff called off the active search. "We're shifting focus to investigation," he told the reporters. "No sign of foul play yet, but we'll keep following leads." The town took it as surrender. Ruth stopped answering the door. The house sank into silence, the kind that gathers when hope has run out, but grief still refuses to settle. On the 12th night, Harold knocked softly on her door. "You need sleep," he said. She nodded, but didn't move. Her hands were folded in her lap, something small and glinting between them. The brass bell's clapper, broken clean from its chain. When he reached for it, she whispered, "They weren't supposed to leave." He frowned. "What do you mean?" But she didn't answer. Outside, thunder rumbled again over Miller's Creek, and for a brief second, the light from the window caught the cornfields in motion, as if something was moving just beneath their surface. By morning, Ruth had vanished too. For half a century, the Summerfield farmhouse stood alone on the ridge above Miller's Creek. Its roof caved in at one corner, its windows fogged from the inside like eyes that refused to shut. The county posted no trespassing signs, but teenagers still came to dare one another to touch the porch rail or ring the rusted bell that no longer moved. In the spring of 2019, a construction crew arrived to clear the property for a new bypass road. They worked until noon before the backhoe struck something solid just beneath the porch. Old wood, then bone. Work stopped. Within an hour, the sheriff had cordoned off the site, and news vans gathered like vultures at the edge of the field. Detective Evelyn Shaw arrived at dusk. The air smelled of cut grass and diesel, and the dying light painted the house the color of dried blood. She'd seen photographs of it her entire career, but nothing prepared her for how small it looked in person. A forensic tech waved her over. "Ma'am, you'll want to see this." Beneath the porch, wrapped in canvas and half buried in clay, was a narrow wooden box the size of a child's coffin. The hinges had rusted shut. When they finally pried it open, a hush fell. Inside lay a bundle of bones, small, delicate, arranged with care. Alongside them were three objects: a child's shoe, a wooden toy plane, and a silver locket tarnished almost black. Evelyn crouched beside it. The bones were too few for 3 children. "One set," she murmured. "Maybe 2. The medical examiner nodded grimly. "Preliminary says 10 to 12 years old. Male Tommy Summerfield then, the oldest." That night the town filled with cameras again, the same way it had in 1969. Old men who'd been boys back then gave interviews about where they were the day the kids vanished. A woman at the diner swore she'd seen Ruth Summerfield walking the road that same night, carrying something heavy in her arms. Rumors resurrected. Evelyn spent the next week combing through the recovered evidence. The locket opened to a photo of 2 children, Grace and Tommy, smiling beside a pond. On the back, faintly scratched by hand, "Keep them close." She could almost hear Ruth's voice in that phrase, half prayer, half command. The sheriff's office petitioned for a search warrant of the remaining property structures. When the crew returned, they found the cellar door swollen shut with rot. Evelyn descended first, her flashlight cutting through a century of dust. The basement smelled of earth and iron. At the far wall, she found something strange. Bricks, newer than the rest. Mortar still visible where someone had sealed an opening long after the house was built. She called for the tech team. Within an hour, they'd broken through the wall. Behind it, another small chamber, empty except for a single chair and a metal bucket. On the chair sat a glass jar sealed with wax. Inside was film. Old, brittle 8mm stock labeled August 1969, Creek. The reels went straight to the state lab. 3 days later, Evelyn sat in the darkened viewing room while the film trembled to life on the projector. The images flickered and bled color. Children running through tall grass, laughing. Tommy, Grace, Eddie. The camera shook as if held by unsteady hands. They crossed a fence line, the sun behind them, turning everything gold. Then the frame jittered. Someone shouting off camera, too muffled to catch. The picture spun sideways. The last thing visible was the creek water rippling, red at the edges, before the film burned out. Evelyn leaned back, pulse hammering. Whoever shot it had been close, closer than any stranger. When the lab enhanced the audio, a single word emerged beneath the static. "Ruth." She drove home under lightning that split the clouds into silver threads. Sleep didn't come. She dreamed of children's laughter echoing through reeds, then cutting off mid-breath. The next morning, a clerk from archives called her. "Detective, you might want to see this. We located the purchase record for the 8mm camera used in that film." "Who bought it?" He hesitated. "Frank Summerfield." August 10th, 1969. Evelyn closed her eyes. 6 days before the disappearance. That evening she returned to the farmhouse alone. The site was quiet now, tape fluttering in the breeze. Inside, the house had begun to give way. The floorboards bowed, the wallpaper sagged in strips. She climbed the stairs carefully, the beam of her flashlight trembling across empty rooms. In what had once been the children's bedroom, the air felt colder. A toy plane, identical to the one found in the box, rested on the windowsill. She crouched, tracing the dust around it. No footprints, no disturbance, as if the object had been waiting all these years. Her radio crackled suddenly, dispatch calling her name, but before she could answer, another sound rose from somewhere below. Faint, metallic, like a bell. The brass bell. She turned off her light, heart pounding. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, from the porch where no one stood. A moment later, silence. She exhaled and forced a half-smile. Old metal, she whispered to herself. Just wind. But as she stepped back into the hall, her flashlight beam caught the edge of the wallpaper where it had peeled away. Behind it, written in faded pencil, were words that hadn't been in any report. They wanted to stay. Evelyn felt the temperature drop. She backed away, steadying her breath, and left the house without looking back. Outside, rain had started again. Soft at first, then heavy, washing the dust from the broken steps. From the road, the farmhouse looked almost clean, as if the storm was trying to erase it. But some stains, she knew, never washed out. The film reels from the Summerfield cellar didn't stay local for long. Within a week, they'd become evidence item number 0471B, logged into the State Forensic Lab in Austin. By the time Detective Evelyn Shaw received the restored digital copy, it had already been watched by 3 analysts, 1 archivist, and a district attorney who stopped halfway through. Evelyn sat in the small viewing room again, lights dimmed. The file loaded on her laptop with a faint pop in the speakers. A black frame, then the tremor of handheld film. Children running, laughing. That same half-golden, half-decaying light that every photograph from the late 60s seemed to hold. Tommy was in front, waving his arms for the others to follow. Grace trailed behind, her braids bouncing. Eddie carried something under one arm, maybe a kite or a towel. The camera panned clumsily, revealing the creek and the willow trees bending low over the water. Evelyn watched the scene again and again, taking notes. Timestamp 0043. The audio wavered, then steadied. 0044. A man's voice, faint. Keep them closer, Ruth. 0045. Another voice, sharper, frightened. Frank, don't. Then static. The next frame was chaos. The camera jerking sideways, light flooding the lens, someone shouting a name. The film ended on the image of rushing water. She paused it there, studying the reflection that shimmered across the surface. It wasn't a child. It wasn't even movement. It was the outline of a face looking back at whoever held the camera. The lab tech leaned through the doorway. Detective Shaw, you might want to see the audio overlay. He handed her a second file. The frequency analysis revealed low-band whispers beneath the surface noise, likely unintentional pickups from the camera's internal mic. When filtered, a single phrase emerged, buried like a ghost. They're already gone. She felt the chill crawl up her neck. The timestamp matched the moment before the film burned out. That night, Evelyn stayed at her office long after everyone left. The rain had returned, a steady whisper against the windows. She opened the old case log again, flipping through the final 1969 interview with Ruth Summerfield. Most of the pages were redacted, but one line, handwritten by Sheriff Holloway, remained. Subject repeated phrase, he buried what he could not keep. Believes husband responsible. No physical proof beneath it. Holloway had written his final remark before the case went cold. Without remains, without confession, there is no crime. Recommend closure. 50 years later, the remains had been found, but only one set. If Ruth had buried Tommy, what had happened to Grace and Eddie? 2 days later, Evelyn drove to the nursing home where Ruth Summerfield had lived before her arrest. The facility sat at the edge of a dry lake, pale stucco under a low sky. The administrator met her at the door. "I'm sorry, Detective," the woman said. "Mrs. Summerfield passed away last night." Evelyn blinked. "When?" "Just after midnight. Peaceful, in her sleep. Was anyone with her?" The administrator hesitated. A visitor signed in under family relations. Name listed as Harold Summerfield. Evelyn's pulse skipped. Her brother-in-law? Yes, ma'am. He left around 11. She seemed calmer after that. Do you have video footage? The woman led her to the office security console. The black and white feed showed Harold entering at 10:22 p.m., carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He sat with Ruth for 40 minutes, then stood, kissed her forehead, and left. Evelyn froze the frame where Ruth held the parcel in her lap. Her lips were moving, counting maybe, or reciting something. The file timestamp ended there. At the county morgue later that afternoon, Evelyn requested Ruth's personal effects. The attendant brought a clear bag containing an old rosary, a broken watch, and a cassette tape labeled "For the Truth." The tape was brittle, its label smudged. She borrowed an old recorder from evidence storage, pressed play, and sat back as static filled the air. Then Ruth's voice, cracked, shaking, but lucid. If you're hearing this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. My children were not taken, they were saved. Frank came back that night angry, said the world was ending, that someone had to pay. He took Tommy first, said it was mercy, said Grace would understand. I tried to stop him. I buried what was left because I thought if the world believed they were gone, he'd stop seeing them. But he never stopped. He said they'd come back when the season turned hollow again, a long breath. Then, quietly, they weren't his children anymore after that. The tape clicked off. Evelyn sat motionless, staring at the recorder. Her pen had stopped midway through a note. If Ruth's story was true, then Frank Summerfield hadn't vanished. He'd hidden. And someone, Harold perhaps, had known all along. That evening, Evelyn drove to Harold's property outside the old grain mill. His pickup sat in the driveway, engine cold. The windows were dark. She knocked once, twice. No answer. The door creaked open under her hand. The smell hit her first. Old oil, dust, and something faintly metallic. On the kitchen table lay the same parcel Harold had carried to the nursing home, now unwrapped. A second cassette tape and a Polaroid photograph. The photo showed the creek, the same spot from the film, but in modern color. The grass grown over, the trees bare, and standing near the water, blurred but unmistakable, was a man in a work jacket, his head bowed. On the back, in neat handwriting, "You're looking the wrong way." Evelyn slipped the new tape into her pocket and backed toward the door. Her headlights cut through the mist as she drove off, but in the rearview mirror, she thought she saw the porch light flick on, a dull yellow eye opening in the dark. The recorder clicked softly in her hand, waiting. Somewhere inside that second tape was the answer to 50 years of silence. But she wasn't sure yet whether the truth would set anyone free or finish what the Summerfields had started. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She sat in her car outside the station, the engine idling, the second cassette turning in her hands like an artifact too fragile to exist. The label was blank, only a smudge of oil along one edge. At 2:14 a.m., she carried it into the evidence lab. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like flies over a wound. She slid the tape into the same battered recorder she'd used for Ruth's message and pressed play. Static, then silence, then a man's voice. Low, cracked, deliberate. "If this finds you, then she's gone. You'll want to believe she was innocent. Maybe she was. I don't know anymore. The truth is what's left when everything else rots away." Evelyn straightened. It was Harold Summerfield. Frank didn't vanish. He built something, out by the old mill, beyond the drainage pit. Said it was to keep them close. I helped him once, just once, carry the boxes. Didn't know what was in them then. When I found out, it was too late. A pause, the faint sound of rain against tin. "There's a door in the mill floor. You'll need the key from Ruth's rosary. Don't go at night. The creek talks after dark. The tape clicked to silence, but for a few seconds longer, the machine hummed as if something else wanted to speak. Then it stopped. Evelyn sat motionless, the words, "door in the mill floor," echoing in her mind. By morning, fog rolled across Miller's Creek like smoke. Evelyn drove east along the dirt road that followed the river bend. The grain mill appeared through the mist. 3 stories of weathered brick and broken glass. Its rusted sign still read, "Summerfield Feed and Supply." The building had been condemned since the 1980s. Boards nailed across the entrance looked gray and soft. She ducked under one and stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rot and machine oil. Dust drifted through her flashlight beam like ash. She found the old conveyor belt first, then the collapsed stairwell leading to the basement. Near the center of the main floor, the wood had been replaced by a sheet of newer plywood. When she knelt, she saw a padlock fixed through an iron ring. The rosary. She pulled it from her pocket, the one taken from Ruth's effects. The small brass cross fit perfectly into the lock's groove, turning with a click that sounded too loud in the stillness. The door opened. A narrow staircase led down into darkness. She descended slowly, her flashlight trembling with each step. The air grew colder. At the bottom lay a chamber, circular, walls lined with shelves of glass jars. Inside each jar floated small objects, buttons, marbles, torn scraps of fabric, faded Polaroids. The floor was dirt, uneven and damp. In the center stood an old projector. Its reel was loaded, waiting. Evelyn hesitated. Then she pressed the switch. The bulb flared to life, spilling pale light onto the far wall. Images flickered. A boy's face, then a girl's. Then the creek again. The camera panned to show a shadow moving through the reeds. It was Frank Summerfield, older than in the 1969 photographs, eyes hollow, skin drawn tight. He looked straight into the lens and spoke. "They're not gone. They're just quiet now. The water keeps their faces." Then the film jumped, the picture warping. The projector rattled and stopped. Evelyn backed away, her breath visible in the sudden chill. Her light swept the wall and froze on something carved into the brick. "Silence is a kindness." Footsteps echoed above her, slow, deliberate. She turned off her flashlight, heart pounding. A silhouette moved at the top of the stairs. "Detective Shaw?" The voice was familiar. The sheriff. "Sir?" she called up, forcing calm into her voice. "Radio said your car was parked outside. You all right down there?" She exhaled in relief, starting up the steps. "Found something." Film, jars. He built a whole room down here. He waited at the opening, beam of his flashlight slicing down. "We'll get forensics in. You shouldn't be alone here." She nodded, but when she reached the top, he was gone. Only the open doorway and the low hum of the wind through the rafters remained. "Sheriff?" No reply. She stepped out into the main floor. Her flashlight swept across the empty space. No footprints, no radio, no sound except the rain outside. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep in the walls, came a slow, dragging noise, like something being pulled across wood. Evelyn turned toward it, hand on her sidearm. The sound stopped. She waited. A moment later, her radio crackled. "Shaw, this is dispatch. Sheriff Holloway's been at the courthouse all morning. You still at the mill?" Her throat went dry. "Copy that," she managed. "Heading out." Later review of municipal works cameras showed no entry or exit at the mill between 1:40 and 2:30. Outside, the fog had thickened into rain. She climbed into her car and started the engine, her reflection trembling in the windshield. Behind her, the mill's windows glowed faintly, as though light still burned inside. That evening, Evelyn filed her report but left the part about the footsteps unwritten. Instead, she replayed the final seconds of Harold's tape, adjusting the gain. Beneath the static, almost imperceptible, came another voice layered under his, something whispering over his words, repeating the same phrase over and over. He never left. She sat back in the dark, listening until the tape clicked off. Outside the station, the rain had stopped. The sky hung low and colorless, and in the distance, thunder rolled again over Miller's Creek, soft, steady, and far too close. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came in waves, thick and gray, turning the back roads into rivers and washing the surface mud from the creek beds. By the 4th morning, the water level near the mill had dropped again, leaving behind streaks of silt and the smell of rusted earth. Detective Evelyn Shaw arrived with a full forensic unit just after sunrise. The air hung heavy, still tasting of metal. Floodlight towers were already burning white circles through the fog, and yellow tape ringed the perimeter like a wound being stitched shut. The sheriff met her by the loading dock, his face drawn, eyes sleepless. "You were right," he said, voice low. "There's a chamber under there." "We brought the state team in as soon as the weather cleared." Evelyn nodded. "Anything moved since yesterday?" "No, but you should see what's down there." They descended through the same hatch she'd opened 2 nights before. The air below was colder now, stirred by the fans the techs had rigged to vent the place. The jars she'd found had been boxed and cataloged, each one numbered and sealed. The projector, however, still stood in the center. One of the technicians, a young woman in a respirator, approached them. "Detective Shaw, Sheriff Holloway. The reel was old, acetate stock, but there's more behind the wall." "More?" The tech nodded. "Looks like a second space. We found a false panel when we scanned for cavities." She led them to the far side of the chamber, where the brickwork showed a thin vertical seam. When the tech slid a crowbar in, the section gave way easily, revealing a narrow tunnel descending deeper beneath the mill. The smell hit first. Old water, mold, and something faintly sweet, like rotted flowers. Evelyn clicked on her flashlight and entered first. The passage sloped downward into a room no larger than a pantry. Its walls were lined with wooden crates, each one stamped with the year 1969, and the same initials burned into the side, FS. She knelt beside the nearest one. "Open it." A tech pried off the lid. Inside lay stacks of small sealed containers, photographic slides, each labeled with a single date: June 23rd, July 2nd, July 5th. Evelyn lifted one carefully to the light. The translucent image showed a child's face. Tommy Summerfield. Eyes open, expression unreadable, background black as void. She picked up another. Grace this time, head turned slightly, hair wet against her cheek. A third. Eddie, half submerged, mouth open in what could have been laughter or a scream. Her throat tightened. He photographed them after they were gone. The sheriff exhaled, stepping back. Jesus. But it wasn't just photographs. In the corner of the room sat a wooden bench covered in rusted tools and jars of chemicals, labels faded to ghosts. On the wall above it hung a single photograph, larger than the rest, framed under glass. It showed the creek, sunlight glinting off still water, and 3 figures standing at its edge. Children, their faces blurred by motion. At the bottom of the frame, handwritten in careful script, "Heaven kept them." I only held the proof. Evelyn stared at it until her vision blurred. "This wasn't about murder," she said quietly. "It was about preservation." The sheriff rubbed a hand over his jaw. He embalmed them in pictures. Or something worse. A tech called from the tunnel. "Detective, you'll want to see this." They followed the voice back toward the main chamber. The tech pointed at the dirt floor near the projector. "We found fresh disturbance. The soil's been turned recently." Evelyn crouched. Her gloved fingers brushed something smooth beneath the surface. She cleared the dirt until a metal shape emerged. A small box, sealed with a single rusted latch. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a camera. Not the handheld Kodak typical of the era, but a strange, custom-built device of brass and glass, wires coiled through its frame. On the back, etched by hand, Prototype 2, Willow. Evelyn stared at it, heartbeat quickening. He built this himself? The sheriff frowned. Willow? That the creek? She nodded slowly. Maybe. Or something else. Another tech approached, holding a clipboard. We ran the jar's serial numbers through old feed store invoices. Frank Summerfield bought large amounts of photographic chemicals in mid-69. Hydroquinone, formalin, silver nitrate. Developing agents, Evelyn said. He was making film, or preserving it. The sheriff looked uneasy. How's a farmer know chemistry like that? She didn't answer. She was still staring at the camera, at the faint smear of something across the lens. For a second, under the glare of the work light, she could swear it shifted, like a shadow crossing glass. Detective, the sheriff said. She blinked, sliding it back into the box. Bag it. Everything here goes to the lab in Austin. By dusk, the mill was empty again. Floodlights dimmed, generators shut down. The last van pulled away, leaving Evelyn alone beside her car. The rain had returned, soft now, almost tender. She leaned against the door, breathing in the scent of wet wood and old iron. The creek whispered somewhere beyond the trees. She thought of Ruth's voice on the tape. They were saved. And of Harold's warning. Don't go at night. The creek talks after dark. When she looked back at the mill, a faint light flickered in one of the upper windows, like a projector restarting itself. She stood there for a long minute, watching it pulse. Then it went out. The next morning she woke from a dream of running water. On her nightstand sat the evidence box with the strange brass camera inside. She had signed an emergency 24-hour evidence checkout, Form CC-19, to conduct continuity testing, but part of her still wanted to keep it close to understand it. When she reached for her coffee, she noticed something else, a Polaroid lying face down on her table. She hadn't left any photos there. She turned it over. The image showed the interior of the mill, lit by floodlights, empty except for one figure standing at the bottom of the stairs. Her. And in the background, faint but visible through the light, 3 child-sized silhouettes watching from the shadows of the tunnel. The photo's timestamp read 4:13 a.m. She'd been asleep at that time. Her hand trembled as she set it down. The air felt suddenly cold. Outside, thunder rolled again over the valley, and the sound of water filled the distance, steady, rhythmic, like breathing. The photo on Evelyn's kitchen table stayed there all morning, its glossy surface catching the light like a sheet of water. She couldn't bring herself to put it in an evidence bag. Every time she turned away, she swore the image shifted. Nothing obvious, just a sense that the silhouettes behind her had moved closer. By 9 o'clock, she'd convinced herself it was fatigue. She slid the picture into a folder and drove to the State Archive Annex in Austin. The brass camera logged under custody tag WS-047 and locked in her passenger seat. The technician waiting for her was an old friend, Dr. Nina Calder, former digital archivist turned forensic image analyst. She raised an eyebrow as Evelyn unpacked the camera. Tell me that isn't what I think it is, Nina said. Depends what you think it is, Evelyn replied. Nina pulled on gloves, examining the device. This isn't commercial. Military prototype, maybe mid-century. Look, hand-etched serial, non-standard film gate, and... She turned it over. Residual circuitry. This thing was designed to record light and charge simultaneously. A hybrid. Evelyn frowned. Meaning? It could imprint an electrical signal alongside the photograph. Like storing a memory, not just an image. Can you pull anything off it? Nina hesitated. If the core isn't corroded, maybe. But it'll take time. I'll wait. Hours passed. Rain streaked the high windows of the lab. Evelyn drifted between the benches, reading the old Summerfield reports again. Ruth claimed Frank heard voices in the creek. Neighbors described strange flashes near the barn at night, all dismissed as grief, fever, or madness. At 3 p.m., Nina called out, "Got something." Evelyn crossed the room. On the monitor glowed a single recovered frame, tinted sepia by decay. It showed the interior of the mill, the same jars and bench, but behind them, faint as a reflection, 3 children stood hand in hand. "They weren't on the film roll itself," Nina said quietly. "They're embedded in the exposure memory." Like an afterimage burned into the plate, Evelyn's pulse quickened. Could it be double exposure? Maybe. Or maybe this thing really did what it was built to do. Nina zoomed in. The children's faces were blurred, yet each carried the same vacant stillness, the absence that photographs sometimes caught better than life. At the top corner of the image, small text shimmered. Numbers, then letters. OPWILLOWDIVPSY 1963. Nina exhaled. "You ever heard of that?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "Willow Creek." The Summerfields lived half a mile from it, but 1963 was 6 years before the disappearances. Whatever OP Willow was, it had started long before the children vanished. That night, Evelyn couldn't stop thinking about it. She pulled the old case box from her closet, laying each photo out across her table. The creek, the barn, the family portraits. The more she stared, the more she noticed a pattern. Faint reflections, like the same window repeating in every background. When her phone rang, the sound made her flinch. "Detective Shaw?" "Yes. This is Dr. Calder. Sorry for the hour. I ran a database cross-check on that project code. You're not going to like this, tell me. Operation Willow, conducted by the Department of Defense, 1962 to 1964. Psychological reconnaissance through optical imprinting. They tested cameras capable of capturing electromagnetic residues from traumatic events. Program terminated after a lab fire killed 3 subjects. Evelyn gripped the phone tighter. And Frank Summerfield, civilian contractor, worked maintenance at Fort Chisholm Research Annex. The same year the line went quiet. "He brought the technology home," Evelyn whispered. By morning the storm had broken, but the sky stayed bruised. Evelyn drove back toward Willow Creek, following the floodplain road to where the river widened near the dam. The water glimmered under thin sun, thick with debris from upstream. She parked near the old bridge, the same one that appeared in several of the recovered slides. Mud clung to her boots as she walked the bank, camera slung at her side. Halfway down the embankment, she noticed something pale caught among the reeds, a roll of film sealed in wax paper. She knelt, peeled it open carefully. The casing matched the prototype's size exactly. Stamped into the metal rim were the words, "Property of OWP." Her radio crackled. "Detective Shaw, this is dispatch." "You near the mill?" "Negative," she said. "At the river mouth." "Why?" "State Lab's been calling all morning. That prototype you turned in, it's missing." She froze. "Missing how?" "Technician says the box was gone when she came in. Security footage corrupted. We're running backups." Evelyn looked down at the recovered roll in her hands. The surface was damp but intact, as if freshly dropped. A faint hum filled the air, the sound of water pressing against stone. Then, somewhere downstream, a child's laugh echoed, thin and distorted. She stood quickly, scanning the banks. Nothing. Only the river curling around the bend, sunlight catching in the current like broken glass. Her pulse raced. She slipped the film into her jacket and climbed back to the bridge. That evening she drove to Nina's apartment with the new rolls sealed in evidence plastic. The hall lights buzzed faintly. When she knocked, there was no answer. She tried again. The door creaked open an inch. "Nina?" The apartment was dark except for the flicker of a monitor screen. On it, frozen mid-frame, was the same image she'd seen earlier, the children in the mill. But now their faces were sharper, eyes open, looking straight at the camera. Beneath the monitor lay a note scrawled in pencil. "Don't develop it." Evelyn's heart sank. The bathroom door stood ajar. Steam drifted from within. She stepped forward and stopped. Nina's reflection stared back from the mirror, but her body wasn't there. Only the imprint of her hand on the fogged glass, fingers spread, palm pressed outward. Evelyn stumbled back, throat dry. She tore the note from the desk, shoved it in her coat pocket, and fled the apartment. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft, rhythmic, endless. She started the engine and gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. In her pocket, the undeveloped roll felt warm, pulsing faintly, as if something inside it was alive and waiting to be seen. She drove toward the only place left where answers still hid, back to the river, where the water whispered and the ghosts of 1969 never stopped watching. The dam looked smaller than Evelyn remembered. Concrete curved between two hills, gray and sweating with years of seepage, its floodgates closed since the droughts of the 1980s. Below it, Willow Creek widened into a slow pool, opaque and green, swallowing reflections whole. She parked at the service road and killed the engine. The world went still except for the whisper of water and the ticking of cooling metal. In her pocket, the undeveloped film seemed to pulse faintly, though she told herself it was only the beat of her own blood. A chain-link fence blocked the catwalk. She ducked beneath a gap, boots grinding on gravel. The air smelled of algae and rust. Every step sent echoes spinning into the valley. At the center of the dam, a maintenance hatch stood half open. It shouldn't have been. County locks were supposed to seal the interior tunnels, but someone had broken it recently. She drew her flashlight and slipped inside. The corridor ran narrow and low, lined with corroded pipes. Water dripped from overhead valves, rhythmic as a metronome. Her light caught chalk marks on the wall, arrows, numbers, and one phrase repeated 3 times. "They wait below." She felt a tremor in the air more than she heard it, a vibration that seemed to hum inside the metal. Following the sound, she reached a small observation room built behind the spillway gates. Machinery loomed like fossils. Control panels, a rusted winch, the old generator. On the floor lay another wax-sealed parcel, nearly identical to the one she'd found in the reeds. Her fingers hesitated before unwrapping it. Inside, a single photograph rested between 2 panes of glass. It showed the dam from above, bright daylight, people standing along the edge. In the foreground was Frank Summerfield, holding a camera, the same brass prototype. And next to him, half turned toward the lens, a younger Evelyn Shaw. She stared. Impossible. She hadn't been born until 1987. Behind the image, faint writing etched into the glass. Everything repeats when it's recorded. Her breath fogged the surface. A metallic clank echoed from deeper in the tunnels. She slipped the photo into her coat and moved toward the sound. The passage opened into a cylindrical shaft descending straight through the dam's core. Catwalks spiraled downward around a column of black water. Halfway down, a faint light glimmered below. Yellow, unsteady, like a lantern. She kept going, one hand on the rail, the other on her sidearm. When she reached the bottom, she found a small platform built beside the intake valve. Someone had set up a work table there. Jars, notebooks, a portable generator humming softly. And on the table, the missing brass camera. Willow prototype too. Its lens pointed toward the water. The shutter clicked on its own, slow and deliberate, each flash followed by a ripple spreading across the pool. Evelyn stepped closer. The film roll inside spun once, then stopped. In the reflection on the water, she saw her own face, and behind it, 3 faint figures standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes luminous and still. She blinked. and they were gone. The shutter clicked again. She reached forward, unplugged the generator. The humming died. For a moment, only dripping water remained. Then the control lights on the dam's panel flickered. Valves groaned overhead. A low vibration shook the floor. She turned, sprinting up the stairs as alarms, long dead, began to wail in rusted tones. By the time she reached the surface, mist exploded from the spillway vents. The creek below churned like something alive. She ran to her car, heart hammering. When she looked back, the dam lights burned in sequence, an old system rebooting itself after 50 years. At dawn, the noise stopped. Emergency crews found her parked on the ridge, soaked and shaking. They asked if she'd triggered the floodgates. She said no. The control room showed no sign of power. Later, when the engineers inspected the interior, they found the workspace she described. But no camera, no generator, no photograph. Only a single footprint in silt, child-sized. That night, Evelyn returned home, exhausted, clothes still damp with river water. She spread the recovered photos across her table again. Each one shimmered faintly under the lamp, as if moisture still breathed inside the paper. From the hall closet, she retrieved the roll of undeveloped film, the one she'd sworn not to touch. For a long time, she stared at it, feeling its small weight against her palm. Then she opened her phone and started recording, her own voice steady but quiet. This is Detective Evelyn Shaw. Evidence log continuation. Willow prototype investigation. If something happens to me, the answers are under the dam. Tell them to drain the reservoir. She stopped recording, slid the phone into her pocket, and set the film beside the other photos. Outside, wind rattled the windows. Somewhere beyond town, thunder moved over Miller's Creek again, slow and patient, as if waiting for her to answer. At first, no one noticed the river was falling. It began before dawn, a slow hiss through the cattails, the soft crack of silt splitting as the waterline receded. By mid-morning, the current had dropped nearly 2 feet, exposing rocks that hadn't seen sunlight since the 1970s. From her porch, Evelyn watched mist curling above the valley like smoke. Her phone buzzed. Dispatch. Detective Shaw, we've got reports of sinkholes opening near the east bank. Dam officials say the lower valves must have jammed open overnight. How bad? Reservoir's draining fast. They're sending a crew to shut it down. She grabbed her jacket and keys, the old habit taking over before the fear could. By the time she reached Willow Creek, half the town had gathered along the bridge. Mud stretched where water had been, and the smell, wet stone, rust, decay, hung thick in the air. Downstream, the dam's spillway roared, churning out a torrent of brown water. Sheriff Holloway stood near the guardrail, hat in hand. He looked older than she remembered, eyes shadowed. "Morning, Shaw," he said. "Guess your ghosts wanted air." She ignored the jab. "Any sign of structural failure?" "Not yet. Corp says the gates are open from inside. Problem is, power's off. Somebody had to crank those valves manually." Her stomach sank. "Inside the dam?" "Right." He hesitated, then handed her a laminated photograph the engineers had found wedged in the spillway fence. The edges were warped, colors running, but she knew the image immediately. Ruth Summerfield, standing in the cornfield behind her house, holding a brass camera in both hands. At the bottom, ink blurred but legible. "You'll see them when the river empties." Evelyn stared at it. Where was this found? Caught on debris 20 feet below the gate. She folded the photo carefully, slipped it into her pocket. "We need to get down there." The spillway access tunnel was half flooded, light bouncing off the low ceiling. Evelyn followed 2 engineers through, water lapping at their boots. The noise was deafening, a roar that lived inside bone. At the main valve chamber, they stopped short. The crank handle lay twisted on the floor, slick with mud. A trail of footprints, bare, small, led from the wheel toward a side corridor that dead-ended at the inspection hatch. Evelyn crouched, pressing her hand against the metal. It was warm. "Temperature shouldn't be this high," one of the engineers muttered. "No active current down here." A faint vibration pulsed through the floor, steady as a heartbeat. "Back outside," she said. "Now." When they emerged into daylight, the river was lower again. A dark line curved through the exposed mud like a scar, snaking toward the old Summerfield property. Evelyn climbed the bank and followed it. Every step sank her deeper, the mud sucking at her boots. She passed broken branches, fish skeletons, a child's bicycle frame glinting in the muck. Then she saw it, a shape rising from the mud at the bend where the children had once played. At first, she thought it was driftwood. Then the sun caught on glass. It was an old sluice frame, rectangular timbers from a buried maintenance hatch, risen upright in the receding mud. No hinges, no intact housing, just a frame studded with rusted bolts, its surface carved with survey marks worn into pattern by silt and time. A full-sized wooden door, upright, half buried, its frame reinforced by rusted nails. No hinges, no walls. Just a door standing alone in the riverbed, its surface carved with looping symbols she didn't recognize. For a moment, she simply stared. Her radio crackled. "Shaw? Status?" She lifted it halfway, then lowered it again. Words felt useless. The door's handle shone wet in the light. She reached out, fingers hovering inches away. A whisper rose from beneath the mud, a sigh more than a sound. She stepped back. The air smelled suddenly of film chemicals, sharp and sweet, the same scent that had filled the mill's chamber. The whisper grew clearer. "Don't develop it." Nina's voice. Evelyn stumbled, mud sucking at her ankles. The door trembled once, a ripple running across its surface like water. Then it stilled. She turned and ran. By evening, the Corps had closed the valves. Water began to creep back into the empty channels, covering the mud and the strange wooden shape. Reporters filled the bridge with cameras, shouting questions about discoveries and hidden structures. Evelyn said nothing. At headquarters, she filed her report, careful, factual. Structural malfunction. Unidentified debris exposed, pending further excavation. When she finished, she placed Ruth's photograph on the desk and studied it under the lamplight. The old woman's eyes were not directed at the camera, but at something behind the photographer, something reflected in the lens. Evelyn turned the picture sideways. In the mirrored curve of the brass camera, she saw the faint outline of a door. That night, she dreamt of the river mouth. In the dream, the water had drained away completely. The creek bed was a road made of glass, and on either side, the missing children walked barefoot through the reeds, their faces calm, unafraid. When she tried to speak, they raised their hands in unison, pointing behind her. She turned and saw the door again, open now, and light spilling out, bright as a projector beam. From inside came a voice she recognized, Frank Summerfield's, weary and soft. "Every photograph is a kind of flood, Evelyn. It keeps what time tries to drown." She woke before dawn, heart pounding, the echo of water still in her ears. Outside, the rain had stopped at last. The valley lay quiet, mist lifting from the river like steam from a wound. In her pocket, the undeveloped roll of film felt heavier than ever. Evelyn waited 2 days before she touched the film again. She told herself it was to rest, to clear her head. But she knew the truth. She was afraid of what might be on it, and even more afraid there would be nothing at all. On the third morning, she packed the evidence box, drove east to the state lab, and signed herself in as both detective and custodian. The archivist behind the counter glanced at the label on the case. "Willow prototype?" She nodded. He handed her a form and said quietly, "You know, you don't have to see what's on it yourself." "I do," she said, and walked down the corridor. The dark room smelled of chemicals and rain-soaked paper. She laid the sealed roll on the counter, gloved her hands, and began unwinding it. The film looked ordinary. Brown, translucent, water-stained at the edges. She loaded it into the developer, poured the solution, waited. The red safety light painted everything the color of blood. Each minute stretched. She could hear her heartbeat in the hum of the ventilation fans. When the reel finished, she lifted it slowly, the negatives glistening with moisture. At first, she saw nothing, only blurred shapes and streaks of light. Then, frame by frame, images began to emerge. The first showed the creek, half drained, shadows bending toward the lens. The next, the mill interior, jars gleaming. Another, Frank Summerfield at his workbench, his face hidden by the camera. But midway through the strip, she stopped breathing. There, exposed faintly between two overexposed frames, was a photograph of her own hands developing film in a dark room. The same gloves, the same table, the same roll. She blinked hard, leaned closer. The next frame showed her again, slightly turned, as though someone stood just behind her, watching through the red light. She flipped to the end. The final negative was blank except for a line of text scratched into the emulsion. "Stop." Her first impulse was to destroy the roll, but she couldn't. Instead, she rinsed it, dried it, and clipped it to the rack. The lab clock read 10:47 a.m. By 11, the negatives were stable enough to scan. She fed them into the reader and watched as digital ghosts appeared on the monitor, each clearer, sharper, colder. At high magnification, she could see details she'd missed before. Reflections in the creek, initials carved into tree bark, the faint outline of a woman standing on the opposite bank. Ruth. Nina's warning echoed in her head. Don't develop it. But she was already too far in. She printed the frames, pinned them to the corkboard in order, and stepped back. The sequence told a story. The children playing by the creek. A storm building behind them. Frank holding the prototype. A flash of light, white, obliterating detail. The children gone. Ruth standing alone, one hand raised toward the lens as if trying to block it. A chemical reaction, Evelyn told herself. Exposure to lightning. Radiation from the prototype. Something physical, not supernatural. But every logical answer left a hole somewhere else. She sat, head in her hands, until the room's timer buzzed. When she looked up, the photographs on the board had begun to curl at the edges from the damp air. For a second, she thought they were moving, but it was only her exhaustion catching up. She gathered the prints, sealed them in an evidence folder, and logged them as recovered material, subject to verification. Before leaving, she double-checked the negatives. The stop frame was still there, clear and sharp. Only now, beneath the word, another faint line had appeared, handwritten, uneven. Let them rest. Outside, the sun hung pale and distant. She drove back toward Miller's Creek, the photographs on the seat beside her like passengers who refused to speak. The sheriff called while she was on the highway. "Shaw?" "Got a favor to ask. Corps pulled more debris from the river mouth. You might want to look. What is it?" "Another camera, same brass casing, serial reads Prototype 1. She gripped the wheel tighter. "Where?" "Upstream, near the old train bridge. Guess the flood brought it out. I'm on my way." The bridge site was quiet except for the drone of insects. Two deputies stood by the embankment tape, the recovered camera resting on a tarp. It was nearly identical to hers, but older, corroded, its lens cracked. "Found it wedged under a fallen log," one deputy said. "No film left inside, just mud." Evelyn crouched, brushed the dirt from the etching. Prototype 1, Willow. A faint number beneath. 1963. The same year Operation Willow had begun. She felt the pieces aligning in her mind. Frank's military job, Ruth's silence, the children's disappearance, the strange after-images. But the pattern was too large, like a photograph printed too big to see all at once. Before leaving, she glanced down at the river. The water had risen again, hiding the mud and the strange door beneath its surface. The current slid past like film through a reel, constant and unreadable. She thought of Frank Summerfield, staring through his lens at the creek half a century ago, convinced that what he saw could be preserved forever if only he captured it correctly. Now she wondered if the real experiment had never been about images at all, but about memory, about how far a person would go to keep the past from disappearing. When she looked back at the cracked brass camera, sunlight glinted through its broken lens, scattering a small rainbow across the mud. For a moment, it looked like an eye-opening. She blinked, and it was gone. That night, in her apartment, she placed both cameras side by side on the table. The air smelled faintly of river water and fixer solution. She switched on the recorder and spoke quietly. Detective Evelyn Shaw, case file update. Subject, Operation Willow and the Summerfield disappearances. Evidence suggests psychological containment rather than homicide. Photographs may represent memory distortion induced by trauma and isolation. Ruth and Frank were not trying to preserve their children's bodies. They were trying to preserve time itself, what they remembered before it broke. She stopped the recorder, listening to her own breathing. Through the window she could see the faint gleam of the river under moonlight, winding through the fields like an exposed strip of film. And for the first time in weeks, the night was silent. The rain came back with the morning. Evelyn drove north through sheets of water that turned the fields silver and blurred the mountains into watercolor shadows. Every few miles, a flash of lightning caught the hood of her car, showing her reflection in the windshield. Drawn, sleepless, older than she remembered. The sheriff had given her an address the night before, Westridge Care Home, room 208. According to county records, one living Summerfield remained. The facility sat on a hill overlooking the old train line. Inside smelled of antiseptic and old paper. The nurse at the desk recognized the badge and pointed her down the corridor. "She doesn't speak much anymore," the nurse said, "but she remembers faces." Sometimes photographs Ruth Summerfield was 91. She sat near the window in a high-backed chair, her hair white and fine as spider silk. A lap blanket covered her knees. The rain made patterns down the glass behind her. Evelyn pulled a chair close. "Mrs. Summerfield? My name's Detective Shaw. I've been looking into what happened in '69. The old woman's eyes shifted, pale blue, alert beneath the haze of age. Evelyn placed a photograph on her lap, one of the recovered negatives, cleaned and printed. It showed 3 children by the creek, their outlines faint, washed in light. Ruth's hand trembled as she touched it. "They were laughing," she whispered, "always laughing. Can you tell me what happened?" A pause, then soft. "Frank said the camera could stop time, that it would keep them safe. The Willow camera?" Ruth nodded slowly. "They came to the house in uniforms, men with briefcases, said it was for memory research." He believed them. Her voice thinned. "We tested it on the cats first. Then the photographs started changing. The more he looked, the less he slept." Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. "And the children? He took them down to the creek. Said the light was perfect that day." Ruth's hand tightened on the blanket. "There was thunder, a sound like glass breaking. When I ran outside." She stopped, eyes filling. "They were gone. Only their shapes in the water, shapes, like negatives waiting to dry." Evelyn let the silence stretch. The rain drummed on the window. In her pocket, her phone vibrated. Another message from the lab. "Analysis complete. You need to see this." She thanked Ruth, promising to return. The old woman smiled faintly, gaze drifting to the storm. Tell him, she murmured. Tell Frank it's finished. Evelyn hesitated. Frank's gone, Mrs. Summerfield. I know. Her eyes flicked toward the window. He still waits when it rains. At the state lab, the technician met her in the viewing room. You said to flag anything off about the negatives, he said, scrolling through the scans. Well, there's something. He zoomed in on the frame marked stop. The emulsion isn't standard. It's layered, like microfilm. There's data beneath the image. What kind of data? Coordinates, timestamps, even faint fingerprints encoded as light density. Somebody embedded information in the exposure itself. He paused. And one print doesn't belong to any of the Summerfields. It's yours. Evelyn felt cold spread across her chest. Mine? He nodded. Matches the glove residue from the development process, but the exposure predates it by decades, like your print was there before you touched it. That's impossible. He gave a helpless shrug. That's photography for you. Light remembers strange things. She left the lab shaken, the rain heavier now, hammering the parking lot like static. By evening, she was back at Miller's Creek. The flood had receded, leaving the banks slick and dark. The old willow tree stood half submerged, its branches dragging in the current. She followed the mud path toward the collapsed mill, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Inside, the air smelled of rot and iron. Water pooled on the floor. She set the camera, the intact prototype, on a beam and took out her recorder again. If anyone finds this, she said quietly, the Willow device appears to store not just images, but impressions. Emotional residue. Each exposure captures the moment's sensory field. Sound, touch, even intention. The film becomes a memory, looping until someone sees it again. The words felt absurd, yet every rational explanation had already failed. She turned off the recorder and looked at the lens. Her own reflection stared back, faintly warped. For a moment she thought she saw children moving in the glass, running through shallows, laughing. But when she blinked, it was gone. She picked up the camera and pointed it toward the creek. Lightning flared. The flashbulb blinked in sympathy, a mechanical mimicry of the storm. The shutter clicked once. Silence followed, so complete that she could hear the water dripping from the rafters. Then a sound, faint but unmistakable. Laughter. 3 voices, distant and overlapping, fading into the rush of the river. Her hands trembled. She lowered the camera. The indicator light on its casing glowed briefly, then went dark. Later, she sat in her car watching the rain beat across the windshield. The prototype lay on the passenger seat, inert. She could end it now, deliver the evidence, close the case, write a rational report about misplaced guilt and faulty memories. But part of her knew that whatever Frank Summerfield had tried to trap in his camera wasn't gone. It had simply waited for someone new to remember. She turned the key, the engine coughing to life. Behind her, through the mirrors, the creek shimmered under a single bolt of lightning, the reflection forming 3 brief silhouettes before dissolving into rain. By dawn, the storm had thinned to drizzle. Evelyn hadn't slept. She drove straight from the creek to the courthouse, the Willow camera locked in the trunk beside the box of prints. The world looked rinsed clean, but the air still smelled of mud and static. Inside, the corridors hummed with fluorescent light and early shift chatter. She walked past it all to the evidence vault. Deputy Franks looked up from his ledger. Rough night? You could say that. She signed the log, placed the metal case on the counter. Archive this under Summerfield disappearance. Chain of custody, sealed. He eyed the faded brass device. That thing what everyone's talking about? Just a camera, she said. Doesn't work anymore. Her desk looked alien after the long nights away. She powered the computer, opened a blank report, and began typing. Summary of findings. 3 minors, Jacob, Lila, and Thomas Summerfield, Disappeared July 1969 from property adjacent to Miller's Creek. Original suspect Frank Summerfield, deceased 1972. Investigation suggests psychological breakdown following experimental photography trials under Department of Defense contract Operation Willow. No physical remains recovered. Probable cause of deaths: drowning during flash flood. Case closed, pending historical review. The language felt dry, bureaucratic, a wall between her and what she'd seen. She stared at the cursor until it blinked like a metronome to her heartbeat. Then she added one more line. Residual evidence indicates memory interference consistent with prolonged trauma among surviving subjects. She hit save, printed, signed. That should have been the end. At noon, the sheriff called her into his office. He held a file in one hand, her report in the other. "Hell of a job, Shaw. 60 years of rumor, and you finally put it to bed." "I'm not sure it's bedded, sir." He smiled. "It is on paper. And that's all the state needs." He pushed the report toward her. "You sure about locking that camera up? Could fetch a museum fee." She shook her head. "Let it rest. Suit yourself. Go home, get some sleep." She didn't go home. Instead, she drove west to the overlook above the river. The afternoon sun burned through low clouds, turning the surface to molten glass. She sat on the hood of her car and let the wind dry the rain from her jacket. When she closed her eyes, the creek's laughter returned, high, quick, overlapping like echoes inside metal. But underneath it now was something softer, a sigh, almost relief. For the first time she could listen without flinching. Dusk found her at the Westridge care home again. Ruth Summerfield was dozing, a photograph in her lap. The nurse had left the lights low. Evelyn knelt beside her. "It's finished," she whispered. "The state's closing the file." Ruth's eyes opened. For a heartbeat they cleared, the fog lifting. "Did you see them?" Evelyn hesitated. "I saw what they left behind." "That's enough," Ruth said. Her hand found Evelyn's, cold but steady. "It never ends with proof. It ends when someone forgives." Outside the window, rain began again. A slow, silver curtain. That night, Evelyn drove the long back road through the pines. Mist drifted between the trunks. She told herself she was only checking the creek one last time before the files were boxed for good. The water was high but calm now. The willow tree bowed over it, heavy with dew. She stepped down the bank, flashlight sweeping over silt and reeds. Something caught the beam, a glint just below the surface. She crouched, reached into the cold. Her fingers closed on glass. A small slide, the kind used in projectors, sealed tight. Inside, a negative no larger than a postage stamp. She held it to the light. 3 children by a riverbank, half smiling, half blurred. Her breath hitched. On the slide's edge, someone had etched a date. July 14th, 1969. She pocketed it and stood very still, listening. The woods were quiet except for the drip of water from the trees. She looked once more at the river, at her own dim reflection quivering there. For a second, another shape seemed to stand beside hers, smaller, brighter. Then a gust of wind broke the image apart. Back home, she placed the slide on her kitchen windowsill where the morning sun would eventually pass through it. She didn't try to enlarge or analyze it. Some evidence didn't need decoding. It only needed to be witnessed. She poured herself coffee, sat at the table, and began to write. Not a report this time, but a letter. To whoever finds this file, the photographs tell one story, the people another. Both are true in their way. I've learned that memory is a kind of river. You can build dams, draw maps, even name the currents, but you can't own the flow. Let the water keep what it needs to keep. She signed it, folded it into the back of the case notes, and sealed the box. The sky outside lightened to pale gold. The season was turning. In a few weeks, the leaves along Miller's Creek would burn red, then brown, then fall away altogether. The hollow would fill with silence again. Evelyn watched the first beam of sunlight catch the tiny frame on her windowsill. For an instant, the negative glowed, the children outlined in gold. Then the light shifted, and they vanished back into shadow. Still there, perhaps, waiting for the next watcher. 10 years later, the county museum built a new wing. It wasn't large, just 2 rooms lined with glass cases and soft lights, but it drew people from across the state. The display near the entrance read, "Willow Creek, Unsolved and Remembered." A single black and white photograph hung in the center. 3 children by a river, smiling toward something just beyond the frame. Below it, a small plaque. Taken August 1969 near Miller's Creek. Photographer unknown. Last known image of Tommy and Grace Summerfield with Eddie marks. Visitors paused there longer than anywhere else. Some said the image felt warm, alive. Others swore the water behind the children shifted when you looked too long. No one mentioned the detective who found it. Evelyn Shaw's name appeared only once, in fine print at the bottom of the exhibit credits. She wouldn't have minded. By then she lived quietly along the coast, teaching basic photography at the community center. Her students called her Miss E. She taught them that a camera was less about capturing truth and more about learning to look. When the rain came, she sometimes walked to the cliffs overlooking the sea. The horizon there looked endless. No riverbanks to trap the current, no echoes from the past. She would stand until the wind numbed her fingers, then take a single photo of the surf breaking against the rocks and toss the developed print into the waves. A ritual, not of forgetting, but of release. She never returned to Miller's Creek, though she kept one small token, a slide frame sealed inside glass. In sunlight it looked blank, but tilted a certain way and faint outlines appeared. 3 figures, a willow tree, a flash of water. She kept it on her bookshelf beside a plant that never seemed to die. One autumn evening, long after the tourists left, she locked up her classroom and sat alone among the empty chairs. The projector clicked softly as it cooled, the smell of fixer still in the air. She opened her old field notebook, pages yellowed with salt and time. On the last page she'd written something years before, a line she hardly remembered writing. "Memory is a photograph the living keep developing." She smiled at that, a small, weary smile. Outside, rain began, a fine mist moving sideways in the wind. She turned off the lights and walked to her car. From the parking lot she could see the ocean far below, a strip of silver under the clouded moon. The air smelled of kelp and rain and something faintly electric. She lifted her camera, the same old Nikon she used now for teaching, and took one picture, just the horizon, the dark water, the faint trace of lightning miles away. When the shutter closed, she lowered the camera and listened to the wind. No voices, no echoes, just the steady rhythm of waves rolling against the cliffs. She thought of the Summerfields, of the willow tree, of all the faces that had once stared into the light and been caught there. For the first time she felt only gratitude. No guilt, no fear. Just the quiet certainty that some stories, once told, finally rest. She slipped the camera into her bag and whispered to the sea, "Let it keep what it keeps." Lightning flashed once, illuminating the waves. For the briefest instant, the reflection on the water looked like 3 children running through sunlight. Then the tide rolled over it, erasing everything but light. Somewhere far inland, a brass bell might have tapped once, if anyone had been listening.